Air in the courtroom was still but not quiet. Papers rustled. Someone coughed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that persistent frequency that makes you aware of time passing in increments too small to matter. I sat at the defendant's table with my hands folded, watching the clock above the judge's bench tick forward. 2:47 p.m. Claire sat across the aisle, her posture perfect, her smile easy. She leaned toward her lawyer, Richard Pemberton, the kind of attorney whose name alone made people nervous, and whispered something that made him nod without looking at her. She laughed, just loud enough for me to hear, and adjusted the sleeve of her cream blazer. Everything about her said she'd already won. Pemberton had been her ace from the beginning. 30 years of practice, a reputation that preceded him into every courtroom in the county, a voice that could make a parking ticket sound like treason. He'd built her case brick by brick, filing motions with surgical precision, painting me as unstable, financially reckless, unfit. I'd watched him work for months. I'd seen judges defer to him, seen opposing counsel hesitate before challenging his statements. Claire had chosen well. She knew it. He knew it. The room knew it. Judge Callahan entered and we rose. The bailiff announced the session. We sat. Claire crossed her legs and smoothed her skirt, glancing at me once with that look, pity mixed with satisfaction, as if she were already deciding what to do with the house. Pemberton shuffled his papers, but something in the movement felt off. Too slow. Too deliberate. His jaw was tight. He wasn't looking at Claire, though she kept trying to catch his eye. The judge asked for an update on discovery. Pemberton stood, cleared his throat, and paused. The pause stretched longer than it should have. Claire's smile flickered. He adjusted his glasses, opened a folder, closed it again. Then he spoke, and his voice was flat, stripped of its usual courtroom confidence. Your Honor, I need to address the court regarding my representation in this matter. The room shifted. Not loudly, just a collective intake of breath, the kind that happens when everyone senses something wrong at the same time. I am filing a motion to withdraw as counsel for the petitioner, effective immediately, due to an irreconcilable conflict regarding the ethical presentation of evidence. Claire's head snapped toward him. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. The judge leaned forward, frowning. Pemberton didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the bench, his hands steady on the podium, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the posture of a man who'd made a choice he couldn't take back. Mr. Pemberton, the judge said slowly, this is highly irregular. Can you elaborate? I'd prefer to do so in chambers, Your Honor, but I can no longer in good conscience continue this representation. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just sat there watching Claire's face as the foundation she'd built began to crack in real time. The marriage didn't end with a fight. It ended with a spreadsheet. We'd been together 11 years when I first noticed the numbers didn't match. Small things at first. Receipts that didn't align with what she'd told me, withdrawals from our joint account that she explained away with a wave of her hand and a distracted smile. I was an auditor by trade, the kind of person who notices when columns don't balance, when patterns shift. For months I told myself I was being paranoid. Claire had always been ambitious, always strategic about money, about connections, about climbing the social ladder in our town. I'd admired that once. I thought it meant she knew where she was going. By the time I realized she'd been preparing to leave for over a year, she was already 3 steps ahead. The accounts had been quietly separated. The investment property we'd bought together was somehow now only in her name, something about a refinancing I'd signed papers for without reading closely enough. She'd cultivated relationships with the right people, the president of the country club, 2 city council members, the senior partner at Pemberton's firm. When she finally told me she wanted a divorce, she did it over coffee on a Sunday morning, calm and composed as if she were announcing a career change. I've already retained Richard Pemberton, she said, stirring cream into her cup. He's the best. You should probably get someone too. I sat across from her in our kitchen. My kitchen, I'd thought, until that moment, and understood that I'd been living in a story she'd written without my knowledge. The protagonist had already been cast out. The first filing arrived 4 days later. The claims were surgical: financial irresponsibility, emotional unavailability, a pattern of controlling behavior. None of it was true, but all of it was plausible enough to make me look twice at my own reflection. She'd kept records, text messages taken out of context, dates I'd worked late framed as abandonment, a single argument from 2 years ago described in language that made it sound like abuse. Pemberton's cover letter was brief and professional, but the subtext was clear. Don't fight this, you'll lose. Friends started pulling away. Not all of them, but enough. Claire had gotten to them first, crying over wine about how hard she tried, how lonely she'd been, how she just couldn't do it anymore. I heard about it third hand, someone's wife mentioning at the grocery store that she'd heard I was going through something, her tone sympathetic but distant, already written off. When I tried to explain, people nodded politely and changed the subject. She'd built the narrative faster than I could counter it. The real blow came 6 weeks into the proceedings. My attorney, a decent man named Tom Garrett who worked out of a 2-room office above a pharmacy, called me at work. His voice was tight. "She's filed a motion for emergency financial relief. Claims you've been hiding assets and threatening her economic security. That's insane. She has access to everything." "I know. But she's also submitted bank statements that show irregular transfers. Looks like you've been moving money." I hadn't been. But when Tom sent me the documents, I saw it immediately: transfers I'd never made, dated and signed with my electronic authorization. She'd had access to my accounts. She'd created the evidence she needed, then reported it as my crime. It was elegant in a terrible way. The kind of move that required planning, patience, and absolute confidence that no one would question her. Pemberton's follow-up motion requested sanctions against me for litigation misconduct and financial malfeasance. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. If the judge ruled in her favor, I'd be covering her legal fees on top of my own, and every subsequent claim she made would carry the weight of judicial precedent. She wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to bury me so deep I'd never crawl out. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot after Tom explained the implications, staring at the steering wheel, trying to understand how I'd ended up here. Then I drove home to the apartment I'd rented, smaller, quieter, emptier than the house we'd shared, and I made a decision. Not to fight her the way she was fighting me. Not to hire a better lawyer or file counter-accusations or play the game she'd already rigged. But to stop reacting entirely. To retreat, rebuild, and let her believe she'd won while I quietly gathered the truth she thought she'd buried. I stopped answering her messages unless they came through the attorneys. I stopped defending myself at dinner parties I no longer attended. I stopped trying to explain to people who'd already chosen which version of events to believe. The noise of the divorce, her accusations, Pemberton's filings, the constant pressure to respond, to justify, to fight back, I let it all wash over me like static I couldn't turn off but could learn to tune out. My life became smaller by design. I woke at 5:30 each morning, made coffee in the kitchen of my 1-bedroom apartment, and went to work before the sun came up. The office was quiet at that hour. I liked the silence, the way numbers behaved predictably when everything else felt rigged. I stayed late too, sometimes until 8 or 9, not because I had to but because going home to an empty apartment meant confronting the reality of how much I'd lost. Work was neutral territory. Spreadsheets didn't lie. Audits didn't play favorites. Tom called every few days with updates. Another motion filed. Another hearing scheduled. Another demand from Pemberton's office, each one more aggressive than the last. Claire wanted the house, the cars, half my retirement, and ongoing support payments that would leave me living paycheck to paycheck for the next decade. Tom laid out the options each time: settle, fight, negotiate, but his tone suggested he knew how these cases usually ended. The spouse with the better lawyer and the better story usually won, and Claire had both. "She's pushing hard," Tom said during one call. "Pemberton's strategy is to exhaust you financially and emotionally until you just want it over." "I know. So what do you want to do?" I looked at the stack of folders on my desk. Bank statements, tax returns, property records, email printouts. I'd been organizing them at night, cross-referencing dates and transactions, building a timeline I couldn't yet see the end of. "I want to keep preparing," I said. Quietly. Tom was silent for a moment. "Preparing for what?" "For when the truth matters." I stopped going to places where I might run into her or her friends. I avoided the coffee shop downtown where she held court on Saturday mornings, the gym where half the members knew our story, the church we'd attended together for years. I wasn't hiding exactly, I just stopped volunteering myself for judgment. People talk when they see you. They whisper when you're not there. I chose not there. My sister called twice a week to check on me. She was furious on my behalf, ready to drive up from Columbus and tell Claire exactly what kind of person she really is. I appreciated it, but I asked her not to. "It won't help," I told her. "It'll just give her something else to use." My sister didn't understand. She wanted me to fight visibly, loudly, to defend myself the way innocent people are supposed to. But I'd learned something in those first months. The system doesn't reward innocence. It rewards evidence, procedure, and patience. At night after work, I sat at my kitchen table and went through the files. I started with the financial records. The transfer sheet claimed I'd made to hide assets. It took me 3 weeks, but I traced every single one. They'd originated from her laptop, using login credentials she'd saved years ago when I'd asked her to pay a few bills while I was traveling for work. I found the IP addresses, the timestamps, the pattern of access. She'd created the evidence methodically, probably thinking I'd never look closely enough to notice. Then I moved to the emails. She'd submitted several in her filings, messages I'd supposedly sent that painted me as controlling and unstable. But email headers don't lie. I pulled the originals from my sent folder and compared them. The versions Pemberton had filed were altered. Not dramatically, a word changed here, a line removed there, but enough to shift the meaning from benign to threatening. She'd edited them before submission, betting that no one would check. Most people wouldn't. But I wasn't most people. I documented everything. I didn't tell Tom yet. I wanted to be sure, wanted the file to be airtight before I showed him what I'd found. I worked methodically, the same way I approached audits at my job, tracking discrepancies and building proof one line at a time. There was something calming about it, about knowing that beneath all her confidence and Pemberton's reputation, the foundation was rotten. Truth was still truth even when buried. Claire called me once during this period. Not through attorneys, directly, late on a Thursday night. I almost didn't answer. "I don't want this to be ugly," she said, her voice soft, almost wounded. "Can't we just settle this reasonably? You know Richard will bury you if we go to trial." I sat in my quiet apartment, phone pressed to my ear, and felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just a strange, distant clarity. "I'll see you in court, Claire," I said and hung up. On my desk lay a single folder, sealed and ready. I wrote the date on the corner in red pen, the day of our next hearing, 6 weeks out. The day truth would finally speak for itself. Tom's office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. He sat across from me at a desk piled with case files, reading through the folder I'd brought him. His expression shifted from skeptical to focused to something close to amazement as he turned each page. When he finally looked up, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "How long have you been working on this?" 3 months. Every night after work. He flipped back to the financial records, tracing my notes with his finger. "These transfers, you're saying she made them herself and then reported them as your misconduct?" "The IP logs prove it. Same laptop, same login credentials she's had access to for years. I documented every single transaction. Dates, times, origination points. She built the evidence she needed and submitted it as if I'd been hiding assets." Tom leaned back in his chair. It creaked under his weight. "And the emails?" "Altered. I pulled the originals from my account with full headers. She changed wording in at least 8 messages before Pemberton filed them. Small edits, but enough to change the context completely." He was quiet for a long moment, studying the documentation spread across his desk. Outside, traffic moved past on Main Street. A siren wailed in the distance. Tom picked up one of the printed emails, held it next to the original, and shook his head slowly. "This is," he stopped, choosing his words carefully. "This is evidence of fraud. Against you, against the court. If Pemberton knew about this when he filed." "I don't think he did. Not at first." "What makes you say that?" "Because he's too smart to stake his reputation on fabricated evidence." Claire fed him the documents. "He trusted his client. He did his job." I paused. "But he knows now. Or he's starting to." Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" I told him about the depositions, the small inconsistencies that had emerged when Claire answered questions under oath. Dates that didn't match her written statements. Claims about my behavior that contradicted her own previous testimony. Tom had noticed them too, but had assumed they were normal witness memory issues. I'd seen something else. The slight stiffening in Pemberton's posture each time Claire contradicted herself, the way he'd started asking her clarifying questions with an edge of impatience, the brief moment during the last session when he'd closed his folder and simply stared at his client as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "He's realizing she's been lying to him," I said. "Lawyers like Pemberton don't get where they are by representing liars. It destroys credibility. Once the court catches you in one fabrication, everything else you've said becomes suspect." Tom nodded slowly. "So what's your strategy here? Present this at trial?" "No. I want to submit it as supplemental discovery now, 2 weeks before the next hearing. Give Pemberton time to review it himself. Let him see exactly what his client has done." "That's a risk. You're giving them time to prepare a response." "I'm giving him time to make a choice," I said. Pemberton's ethical. He has to be. 30 years of practice in a small legal community means his reputation is everything. If he realizes Claire fabricated evidence and used him to submit it to the court, he can't continue representing her. Not without becoming complicit. Tom studied me for a moment. You're betting he'll withdraw. I'm betting he'll do what any good attorney would do when they discover their client has been lying, protect himself and his practice. Claire thinks she bought his loyalty. But what she really bought was his professional reputation, and she's about to destroy it if he doesn't distance himself. We spent the next hour preparing the submission. Tom drafted the cover memo carefully, noting that newly discovered evidence called into question the accuracy of previously filed documents. He didn't accuse Claire directly, that would come later, but he laid out the discrepancies clearly enough that any competent attorney would see the implications immediately. We attached the IP logs, the original emails with full headers, the transaction records showing the pattern of access from Claire's devices. Everything documented, everything verifiable, everything impossible to dismiss as coincidence or mistake. When Pemberton sees this, Tom said, sealing the envelope, he's going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with his client. I know. And if he doesn't withdraw? Then we presented at trial and let the judge decide whether officers of the court should face sanctions for submitting fraudulent evidence. I stood, gathering my copies of the documents. But he'll withdraw. He's too smart not to. Tom walked me to the door. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across his cluttered office. You've been patient, he said. Most people in your position would have lost it months ago. I thought about Claire across town, probably planning her victory party, maybe already deciding what furniture she'd keep from the house, confident that Pemberton's reputation would carry her through. She'd underestimated me completely, assumed I'd break, assumed I'd fight emotionally, assumed I'd never look closely enough to see what she'd done. Patience isn't about waiting, I said. It's about letting people reveal themselves. The supplemental discovery went out on a Friday afternoon. Tom filed it electronically and sent a courtesy copy to Pemberton's office by courier. I imagined him opening it Monday morning with his coffee, skimming the cover memo, then stopping when he reached the attachments. I imagined his expression changing as he cross-referenced the IP logs against the filing dates, as he compared the email headers to the versions he'd submitted under his signature. I didn't have to imagine the phone call that followed. Claire mentioned it later, during her testimony, her voice sharp with betrayal. He'd asked her to come to his office immediately. No pleasantries. No reassurance. Just come now. By Tuesday afternoon, Tom received a formal notice. Pemberton was requesting an emergency conference with Judge Callahan. Claire wasn't informed in advance. That detail told me everything I needed to know. Wednesday morning arrived cold and gray. I drove to the courthouse early, parked in my usual spot near the back of the lot, and sat in my car for 10 minutes watching people stream through the main entrance. Attorneys with briefcases. Clerks clutching coffee cups. Witnesses checking their phones nervously on the steps. The machinery of justice grinding forward, indifferent to individual outcomes. I grabbed my folder, thinner now, most of its contents already filed, and walked inside. The courtroom was exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks earlier. Same wooden benches, same fluorescent hum, same clock above the judge's bench ticking forward with mechanical precision. Claire was already seated, her posture perfect as always, but something was different. She kept glancing at Pemberton, who sat beside her reviewing documents with unusual intensity. He wasn't acknowledging her looks. His jaw was set in a way I recognized from depositions, the expression of a man preparing to do something he didn't want to do but knew he had to. Tom and I took our seats. The bailiff announced Judge Callahan. We rose, then sat. The judge shuffled papers, made a note, then looked up with an expression that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine hearing. Mr. Pemberton, I understand you requested this conference. The floor is yours. Pemberton stood. He buttoned his suit jacket, a habit, probably a gesture of professional composure, but his hands weren't entirely steady. Claire leaned forward slightly, confusion flickering across her face. She started to whisper something to him, but he stepped away from the table before she could speak. Your Honor, I need to address a matter that has come to my attention regarding my representation in this case. His voice was controlled, but I caught the underlying tension. I have recently reviewed discovery materials that cast significant doubt on the accuracy of certain documents previously submitted to this court under my signature. The room went silent. Not the restless silence of people waiting, but the frozen silence of everyone suddenly paying attention. Claire's face went pale. She reached toward Pemberton's arm, but he moved again, staying just out of reach. Specifically, he continued, I have been provided with evidence suggesting that financial records and correspondence filed on behalf of my client may have been altered or fabricated prior to submission. I was not aware of these alterations at the time of filing. Judge Callahan's expression hardened. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Pemberton. Yes, Your Honor. Which is why I am filing a motion to withdraw as counsel, effective immediately, based on an irreconcilable ethical conflict. I can no longer represent Ms. Holloway in good conscience, as continuing to do so would potentially make me complicit in conduct that violates my professional obligations. Claire stood abruptly. Richard, what are you? Ms. Holloway, the judge said sharply, sit down. She remained standing for another second, her mouth open, disbelief and fury warring on her face. Then she sat, slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Pemberton continued, his voice steady now, almost clinical. The opposing party submitted documentation 2 weeks ago including IP address logs, original email headers, and financial transaction records that directly contradict materials I filed in September and October. Upon independent verification, I have confirmed that the documents I submitted, which were provided to me by my client, appear to have been modified after their creation. The emails show edited content. The financial transfers originated from my client's devices, not from Mr. Holloway's accounts as initially claimed. He paused, and in that pause I heard everything he wasn't saying. The anger at being used, the humiliation of having his reputation staked on lies, the calculation that his 30-year career mattered more than one client's vendetta. I advised my client of these findings yesterday, he said. She maintained that the discrepancies were misunderstandings. However, the technical evidence is conclusive. I cannot continue representation without either withdrawing the disputed filings, which would effectively concede fraud, or proceeding with knowledge that my client has misrepresented material facts to this court and to me. Judge Callahan leaned forward. Mr. Pemberton, are you saying you believe your client submitted falsified evidence? A long pause. Then, I'm saying the evidence speaks for itself, Your Honor. And my ethical obligations require me to withdraw rather than participate further in this matter. Claire made a sound, half gasp, half choke. She turned to look at me for the first time that morning and I met her eyes. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked back at her, steady and calm, the way I'd looked at numbers that didn't balance, at patterns that revealed themselves when you paid attention, at truth that waited patiently to be found. Judge Callahan granted Pemberton's withdrawal motion. He set a new hearing date 60 days out, giving Claire time to find new representation. But we all knew what had just happened. The best attorney in town had publicly stated he couldn't ethically represent her. Every other lawyer would see Pemberton's withdrawal motion. They'd read between the lines. Most would decline to take her case. As we left the courtroom, Claire stood alone at her table, staring at nothing, her perfect posture finally broken. 5 years have passed since that morning in Judge Callahan's courtroom. I still drive past the courthouse sometimes on my way to work and I always notice it. The limestone facade, the brass doors, the steps where I used to sit during lunch breaks trying to make sense of how my life had fallen apart. It looks smaller now, or maybe I've just moved far enough away from that version of myself that the building has lost its power. The divorce was finalized 8 months after Pemberton withdrew. Claire hired an attorney from 2 counties over, someone who didn't know either of us, who took the case for the money and probably regretted it within a week. The settlement was fair, finally, actual division of assets based on reality rather than fabrication. I kept my retirement account. We split the proceeds from the house. No ongoing support payments beyond what was reasonable. The judge, who'd read Pemberton's withdrawal motion carefully, had clearly formed her own conclusions about who'd been telling the truth. I never saw Claire again after the final hearing. I heard she moved to Indianapolis, started over somewhere people didn't know the story. Part of me hopes she found whatever she was looking for. Most of me just doesn't think about it anymore. I rebuilt my life in the same town in the same job, but everything feels different now. I bought a small house on the east side, nothing fancy, just enough space for me and the life I've built. I still wake early, still make coffee in a quiet kitchen, but the silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels like peace. My sister visits every few months. She was right to be angry on my behalf back then, but she understands now why I chose patience over fury. You knew, she said last Christmas, sitting at my kitchen table. Even when it looked like you were losing, you knew. I told her I didn't know. I just trusted that truth was heavier than lies and eventually weight wins. Tom Garrett retired last year. We had lunch before he closed his practice, and he told me my case was one of the ones that reminded him why he'd become a lawyer in the first place. Not because we won, he said, but because you never stopped believing the system could work if you gave it the right information. I thanked him for being patient with my patience. Sometimes I think about Pemberton, wonder if he ever thinks about that morning when he stood up and chose his integrity over his client. I hope he does. I hope he knows that decision mattered, that it changed the trajectory of someone's life in ways that had nothing to do with money or custody or property. I drive past the courthouse and I remember who I was sitting on those steps, broken, scared, alone. And then I drive home to the life I built afterward, and I'm grateful for both versions of myself. The one who endured and the one who learned that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just truth, waiting quietly until someone's ready to listen.